Today we're going to briefly go over some of the fighting strategies and new technology used in World War I. And if you don't know much about World War I, it was extremely brutal. It was a terrible war to fight in because of a lot of the ways this new technology was used, paired with the use of the trench system. So here we go. To begin, trench warfare. It wasn't first used in World War I, but it was the first war that we really saw it used extensively, and it was brutal. If you can imagine, most of the war people are going to spend below grounds, making sure they're not exposed to the enemy, and that made for a pretty rough existence. The only times you would come out of the trenches, usually, if you were on the front battle lines, would be to run out towards the enemy. And when you're running towards the enemy, you have very little cover. It's usually over either flat ground or ground that's littered with craters from artillery shells. And when you meet the enemy, they are in their trench like this here. And so maybe you see their heads, but that would be about it. And that made it pretty difficult. At the same time, anytime you're trying to move people around, they have to remain in the trenches as well. So they don't get to go up above ground. So if you have wounded soldiers, you want to move them in the trenches so they're not exposed, and all those kind of things as well. This warfare that happened created just terrible scenes. The places in between the trenches would just be destroyed. You can see this was a forest at one point, and it obviously is no longer. And so here's what you have for your trench system. Usually you would have a frontline trench, as you can see here. But then you would have layers. You have a second row and a third row, so that if the enemy gets this line, you can move back to this line, so on and so forth. You have your artillery in the front, in the back, that can shoot and hit the enemy if they attack. You have barbed wire in front of your trenches to provide for additional protection that really makes it so that everything's slowed down. Your aircraft can attack the enemy from above, or they can just be spotters and kind of explain what's happening. A lot of times there would be dugout areas underneath. It may be a place to eat. It may be an officer's mesh. It may be some sleeping bunks that would be underground. But literally most of your time is spent underground, and any time above ground, if you're in the front here, is very dangerous. Or if you're in the back, you have a little bit more room to maneuver. But make no mistake, it's a very rough place to be. So there's a lot of new weapons that make this a very catastrophic war, and we'll run through those briefly here. The first one is poison gas, and this is that dirty killer. Artillery shells could launch poison gas. It would smoke into an area, and anybody in that area might be affected. Sometimes people would suffocate, they'd be blinded. Sometimes it would kill the enemy, depending on the situation. After World War I, it's so bad that we actually outlaw it, and it can't be used again. And you know, you see these pictures of people in gas masks, and it's just creepy. They kind of made whatever they could for gas masks. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. But if you didn't get it on in time, you might be done for. You might not see again, different things like that. They also try to make gas masks for their horses. You can see an example here. Sometimes there's dogs using the front line. You'd have that as well. And you can see where the artillery hit. All the shells are landing along this line, and all that gas is fuming back over the enemy. Now, one of the things you really had to watch if you're going to use gas is the direction of the wind. Because if that wind changes directions, all of a sudden, instead of the gas going towards the enemy, it's going towards you. So it's a very brutal weapon, and certainly a weapon that we don't want to see in war anymore. And this is the results. The reason that it's outlawed is because it does things to people that you can't get back. Especially in 1918 when the war is over, if somebody loses their sight, there's not many jobs for them anymore. And so their whole existence and their ability to feed their families has been ruined in many ways because of this. The next one is a fighter plane. And if you think about planes, they made amazing technological advances during World War I. They start out as spotter planes, and they're just wood and fabric. And they're not very high tech. They're pretty slow. But by the end of the war, we have machine guns that can fire literally between the propeller blades. You're firing your machine gun right through the propeller blades, and when the blade's going to come up where your machine gun shoots a bullet, it just prevents the gun from shooting. And so they're shooting hundreds of bullets straight on through the propeller blades They're very fast by the end of the war. Some of them are able to drop small bombs, and so a lot of advancements there. But what it provides is air superiority. You have the ability to see the enemy. You can fly over their trenches and see how they're laid out and report those things back. You can kind of tell artillery where they should be firing, different things like that. And that was a big advancement. But as both sides start to arm these planes, then you see dogfights, and you see all these airplanes in the air, and they're going towards each other, and they're trying to destroy each other. And so it's the first time we have fighting in the air with planes. At first, it's people in the air that have like a pistol or a rifle, and then they start to mount machine guns onto their airplanes, and they become pretty technologically advanced by the end of the war. And so here's a few examples. Here's the Fokker triplane. This is a German model that was very, very good in the war. Here you can see an American model. This is an older model because it has a machine gun on top of the wing. And the downside to that is that you're not shooting exactly where you're seeing. Later on, this one here, this is a newer gun here that shoots right through the propeller blades towards the enemy. Now, machine guns were the biggest change in the war. They change everything. They can shoot 600 bullets a minute. Nobody else could do that. And so while everybody else is using bolt action rifles where you have to pull the bolt back between each shot, machine guns can just keep going and going. And in this trench system, they are the perfect weapon. Because if we go back to our first slide that we had, imagine you have all these people running towards you. If you have a machine gun right here, you can just mow them down. You can slaughter them. So machine gun was the perfect defensive weapon because everybody's running at you. All you have to do is aim and pull the trigger. But it's also the most catastrophic weapon that the war produced because you had so many people dying because of its bullets. So here you can see an example of a machine gun. These are water cooled. They have a water barrel around the barrel itself to keep it cool. And these are very, very big weapons. Barbed wire was another weapon that was new in the war that had some pretty nasty consequences. They wouldn't just put up like a line of barbed wire like you see a fence that we know. They put up lines like this. And as you can imagine, you can't get through that. And so if you wanted a really good defensive front, this was it. You put that barbed wire up. Pair this with a machine gun, good luck getting through that. And what people would have to do is they would literally have to lay their bodies down. Somebody would lay on top of this barbed wire, and other people would come and jump off their back to get over it. If you're the person laying down, you're going to die, most likely. But this makes fighting very difficult too. And sometimes they would just make a huge mesh like this that was very effective in stopping the enemy. And so if you're going to have an attack, you might have to go ahead the night before and have somebody trying to clip it and open it up, or maybe put some explosives in to blow it up, whatever you can, because it was a tough situation. Here you can see some crosses where people died in the barbed wire. Sometimes it'd just be a field you'd have to get through. And it leads many, many more people to die. This becomes a much more catastrophic war because of that. Now tanks, another weapon that we have in warfare. They were very slow and cumbersome. They didn't have a whole lot of firepower, but they were big and they were hard to destroy, and they were really, really scary. Most of these people, whether they lived on a farm or lived in the city, had never seen anything bigger than a horse and buggy. And so all of a sudden you have this metal tank coming at you, and when you shoot at it, your bullets just ricochet off. And as you can see, they have these big guns here. They'd have machine guns in the front. And so while they were slow, they weren't real great. The exhaust actually went into the crew compartment, so sometimes they'd get suffocated by their own gas. But it was hard to stop these things. Very few things could stop them. They could run right over your trench and keep going. And so they were the greatest weapon in terms of advancing forward. And they did provide some protection because those people in them obviously aren't going to get hit by bullets. But boy, they were a really scary weapon if they were used against you. So here are some tanks. Some of them were bigger, like this British tank. Sometimes they would get stuck in trenches, as you can see here. Others were smaller. I believe this is a French tank. But they're the first of what becomes many, many tanks to come out in the future. So that's why they're so important. Another weapon is a U-boat. This one is used at the sea. It wasn't the first time submarines were around, but it was the first time they were used very actively in war. And boy, did these cause fear. Imagine that you're a ship just sitting there, you don't see any enemies, and all of a sudden the boat next to you is blown up. And you don't know what did it because there's not another ship around. It's a submarine. And you scan the waters, but if their periscope goes down, you can't even see them. And so they fire torpedoes underwater. They're very effective in that way, and they cause a lot of fear because of that. The Allies considered them immoral and wrong to use because you couldn't see them. They couldn't detect them. Radar did not exist yet. And so these are the beasts that lurked underneath. For the crews, these were not good ships to be in. While they protected you because you could dive underneath the water and the enemy couldn't see you, if the enemy did find you, you could only dive so far before your ship would literally collapse from the pressure. A lot of times people had to be in these for days at a time, and you did have to surface from time to time. You couldn't stay underwater forever, and so sometimes you had to surface potentially by an enemy. But they blew up a lot of ships, and that made life very, very miserable for those opposing them. And so these are what we see in terms of the different weapons of war. When you put them all together, all those on the battlefield, this is what you have. No man's land. This area between the trenches where all kinds of people are running to try to defeat the enemy, and all kinds of people died. And so it's not a fun war by any means. No war is fun, and it's certainly brutal and savage because of the different technologies that are used. And largely, the armies just didn't know how to deploy men with this new technology yet. They're still using the old strategies of having a whole group run in a line and putting machine guns and artillery and gas and barbed wire in front of them. Stop that in a hurry. So that's what I have for today. Feel free to always email me if you have questions.